Kevin Brown had never thought of himself as someone who needed a quiet life, but after years of military service flying helicopters across unforgiving landscapes, the wide field on the edge of his property became the only place where he truly felt grounded. It was a stretch of land left to him by his grandfather, a stubborn man who had refused to sell to developers when the rest of the neighborhood was slowly absorbed into a uniform subdivision governed by the local HOA. Unlike the polished cul-de-sacs with their cloned lawns and beige mailboxes, Kevin's land was wild, a mix of grass, scattered trees, and a shallow stream that cut across one side. For him, it was not just property but a reminder that independence could still exist in a world obsessed with conformity. He maintained the field in his own way, mowing the edges, keeping the drainage clear, but never flattening or taming it into something artificial. What made the place truly his was that it doubled as his landing spot. After leaving the military, he continued flying commercially, and the helicopter he had invested in was more than a machine. It was his way of refusing to be boxed in, his ticket to the skies when the ground became too heavy. Sometimes he would circle back from long assignments and feel a kind of electricity run through him as he descended over the tree line, the rotors scattering the tall grass below, the tires kissing earth that belonged to him alone. The sound would echo across the neighborhood, unsettling some of the residents, but Kevin never apologized. He was careful, licensed, and entirely within his rights. The HOA had complained in vague letters more than once, but the land was registered outside their jurisdiction, and no matter how they postured, they could not dictate what he did on it. At least, that was what he believed. His grandfather had warned him in his will that the association would never stop trying to draw new lines, that they fed off ambiguity in documents, that their power came not from the law itself but from the way they made people too tired to resist. Kevin had brushed that off, thinking those words belonged to another era, a time when people fought over fences and boundary stones. But as the years passed, he noticed the creeping signs. The HOA newsletters that listed his field as a community reserve zone, the way their maps sometimes shaded his property in faint gray, as if it were already claimed. He dismissed it as sloppy paperwork or the wishful thinking of petty board members, but the irritation lingered, and he kept every envelope they sent, just in case. Despite that undercurrent of tension, the field remained his sanctuary. On early mornings he would stand by the stream and watch fog roll across the low ground, listening to the sound of distant traffic muffled by the trees. The world reduced to silence and space. Neighbors rarely set foot there, and when they did, it was usually children chasing a ball too far or someone walking a dog that slipped its leash. Kevin did not mind. He understood that open land drew people in. But he always made sure they left knowing it was his land, not some communal extension of the subdivision. That boundary mattered, because it was the last thing his family had held on to when everyone else had surrendered their lots to uniformity. The field was freedom, proof that not every inch of the world had to be ruled by bylaws and boards. Yet the more he held on to it, the more he felt the invisible pressure of eyes from across the fence lines. Neighbors who smiled politely but whispered when the helicopter rattled their windows, board members who nodded coolly when he passed, but circulated memos behind closed doors. He did not know how close that pressure was to breaking until one late afternoon. Returning from a trip, he circled over his field ready to land and saw something that made his breath hitch. The grass was gone, buried beneath rows of gleaming cars, parked bumper to bumper in neat formation, their roofs flashing in the low sun like a metallic sea. The field, his refuge, was no longer his. Kevin's first instinct when he saw the cars sprawled across the field was that there had been some kind of mistake, maybe a wedding party that had confused the lot with a rented meadow or an emergency that forced people to park on the nearest open ground. But as he descended closer and the helicopter blades stirred up the dust, he noticed how deliberate the arrangement looked. The neat white lines sprayed across his grass to mark individual parking slots. The portable signs hammered into thee. soil directing vehicles toward resident overflow area. The whole scene executed with the kind of precision that only came from official planning. He pulled back on the controls, unwilling to risk landing in the middle of the mess, and circled away, anger building in his chest, his jaw tightening until it felt like stone. By the time he reached the small municipal pad on the far side of town and drove back in his truck, the cars were still there, their owners milling around as if nothing were unusual, children climbing onto his old fence rails, someone dragging a cooler across ground that had once been untouched grass. He parked by the ditch and walked directly into the field, ignoring the looks of confusion and mild annoyance from strangers who clearly thought he was the intruder. When he demanded to know what was happening, one of the volunteers in a bright orange vest, a man he recognized vaguely as living 3 streets over, handed him a folded sheet of paper with the HOA letterhead. "Community decision," the man said with a shrug, as if that explained everything. Kevin unfolded the sheet and read with mounting disbelief that the HOA board had voted to temporarily designate his field as a parking facility to alleviate congestion during neighborhood events and gatherings, citing unused land adjacent to the subdivision and lack of demonstrated private function. It concluded with a breezy statement that all costs of surface maintenance would be reimbursed, and thanked him for his community spirit. There was no signature from him, no consent, no acknowledgement that the land did not fall under their charter, just a declarative tone as though the matter were already settled. He confronted the man in the vest, saying flatly that this was his private property and they had no right to touch it, but the man gave a nervous laugh and muttered that he should take it up with the board president, Evelyn Marks, because she was the one who had authorized it. That night, Kevin could not sleep. He paced the length of his porch with the crumpled sheet in his hand, replaying the images of cars littering the field, the way people acted as if the land had always belonged to them, the casual dismissal of his ownership. He dug through his grandfather's old files, pulling out the deed, the tax records, the notarized surveys that had been updated only 3 years earlier, each document a clear line of defense against the HOA's encroachment. He stacked them on the kitchen table like ammunition, convinced that a face-to-face confrontation would end the matter quickly. The next morning, he walked straight into the HOA office, a converted storefront in a strip mall, its glass door decorated with a cheerful decal of the neighborhood logo, a row of beige houses beneath a smiling sun. Inside, he found Evelyn Marks sitting at a round table with 2 other board members, sipping coffee and leafing through binders. She was a tall woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pinned immaculately, the kind of person who radiated an aura of practiced authority. When Kevin introduced himself and demanded an explanation, she greeted him with a professional smile, the kind that was meant to look warm but never reached the eyes, and gestured for him to sit. He remained standing. Evelyn explained that the board had assessed the field as underutilized land contiguous to the development, which under their interpretation of community easement allowed temporary use for collective benefit. Kevin cut her off, voice hard, pointing out that the land was legally his, taxed under his name and not bound to their association. She did not flinch. She calmly replied that while that may have been true decades ago, revised bylaws incorporated all adjacent parcels that were not actively developed, and since he had not registered the field as a functional agricultural or residential lot, it fell, within their discretionary oversight. The sheer absurdity of her reasoning left him momentarily speechless. He slapped the deed down on the table, forcing her to look at the county seal, the unbroken chain of ownership from his grandfather to him. Evelyn skimmed it and nodded politely, saying she appreciated his concern but that the matter was already settled by vote. "The residents need relief parking," she said evenly, "and your lot provides a safe, central option. This is about community, Mr. Brown. I am sure your grandfather, rest his soul, would have wanted to help." At that moment, Kevin felt his temper flare, but he restrained it, knowing that outbursts would only be twisted against him. He gathered his papers and told her the field was not theirs, that he would remove the cars himself if they did not leave by the weekend. Evelyn's smile finally thinned, the mask slipping just enough for a glimpse of irritation. "I would strongly advise against unilateral action," she said, her voice edged with warning. "If you interfere with board-approved use, we will have no choice but to escalate." She rose from her chair and handed him a printed schedule of upcoming events, each one noting his field as Overflow Lot A. Driving home, Kevin realized the scope of what he faced. This was not a misunderstanding that could be smoothed out with a deed and a conversation. It was a calculated move, a land grab cloaked in bureaucratic language designed to wear him down until he surrendered. He parked his truck at the edge of the field again and looked out over the rows of cars, feeling the weight of his grandfather's warning at last. The HOA did not fight fair. They never had. They relied on exhaustion, on neighbors who shrugged and said it wasn't worth the hassle, on owners who could not afford drawn-out disputes. But Kevin was not built to surrender. He had flown through dust storms and night raids, landed in places where one wrong movement meant fire and wreckage, and he had survived. Compared to that, this was a new battlefield, but it was still one he knew how to fight. As the sun sank and headlights flickered on across the stolen field, Kevin clenched his fists and whispered a vow to the silent land beneath those cars. They would not take it. Not while he was still here. Kevin spent the next 2 days watching his field from the porch as if it were enemy territory, trying to decide whether to act immediately or wait for the HOA to make their next move. And with each passing hour his frustration deepened because he could see how quickly the board had normalized the theft, how the neighbors walked across the grass without hesitation, how cars came and went as if it had always been a designated lot, and how the children now rode bicycles through the ruts that tires had carved into the soil. By the third day, when he woke to the sound of a truck idling outside his window, he grabbed his jacket and stormed down to the ditch to find 2 workers in reflective vests unloading rolls of temporary fencing, setting them up at the edge of the field as if to give the space a professional veneer. And when he demanded to know who had authorized this, one of them held up a clipboard with Evelyn's signature and told him it was community-approved infrastructure. Kevin laughed bitterly and told them to pack it up before he called the sheriff, but the workers shrugged and went on hammering posts into the soil. He pulled out his phone and dialed the county office, asking to speak with the Land Records Division, and after being passed between clerks, he finally reached someone who confirmed that his deed was valid and the land was private. But when he asked whether the county would enforce removal of trespassers, the woman on the line hesitated and said only that disputes between HOAs and property owners were civil matters. Kevin slammed the phone shut and realized that if he wanted his land back, he would have to take steps himself. That afternoon he drove into town, rented a heavy flatbed trailer with a mounted GPS tracker, and parked it in the middle of the field, chaining the wheels and locking the hitch, a silent declaration that the property was not for them to use. He even marked the coordinates on his map, knowing that if they tried to move it, the tracker would tell him where. When he returned the next morning, the trailer was gone. The chain had been cut cleanly, the tire ruts showing where it had been dragged out, and the field was once again filled with cars as if nothing had happened. Kevin searched the surrounding streets, circling the neighborhood for hours, but the trailer was nowhere to be found. It was only when he returned home, exhausted and fuming, that he noticed a small figure waiting on his porch steps. A boy of about 12, the grandson of one of his few friendly neighbors, held something in his hands. The broken GPS unit, its casing cracked, its wiring mangled, as if someone had smashed it deliberately before tossing it in the trash. The boy explained that he had found it near the dumpsters by the community center, and when Kevin checked the memory chip still intact inside, he saw the last recorded route, a straight line from his field to a dead-end service road behind the shopping plaza. That night he drove out to the service road and found nothing but gravel and dark warehouses. But when he stepped from the truck and bent down, the soles of his boots scraped through a fine layer of dust that clung unnaturally to the asphalt. He recognized the pale grit immediately. It was the same crushed stone he had spread near the stream bank on his field weeks earlier. His trailer had been there, if only briefly, before being moved again. When Kevin returned to the field the next morning, he found something worse. Freshly painted lines now divided the lot into numbered spaces, and at the entrance a new sign announced Resident Overflow Lot A, managed by HOA. It was as if they had erased his existence with one stroke of paint and plywood. He marched across the grass to tear the sign down, but before he could reach it, a black SUV pulled up and Evelyn stepped out, dressed in her immaculate blazer, clipboard in hand, smile as sharp as glass. She greeted him like a guest, not the owner, and informed him in her clipped professional tone that his interference was becoming a concern. When he demanded to know what had happened to his trailer, she raised her eyebrows and said that she had no knowledge of unauthorized equipment being left on community land. But if he believed a crime had been committed, he was welcome to file a police report. Kevin clenched his fists and told her that she knew damn well it was his property and his equipment, and that cutting chains and hauling it away was theft. Evelyn's smile did not falter, but her voice dropped low enough that only he could hear. The board has already voted, Mr. Brown. If you push this further, you will only make things harder for yourself. Accept the decision, and we can all move forward peacefully. For the first time, Kevin felt a chill crawl up his spine because it was no longer just about bureaucracy or bad faith. It was a deliberate strategy of erasure, a calculated campaign to strip him of authority until even the neighbors believed the land was never his. That night he walked the perimeter of the field under cover of darkness, planting wooden stakes at the old survey points his grandfather had marked decades earlier, driving them deep into the soil with a mallet, each one a reminder that the boundary still existed. He sprayed the tops with bright paint so no one could pretend not to see them. By morning, half the stakes had been yanked out and tossed aside. He found one broken across the hood of his truck, another nailed mockingly to the HOA sign. The message was clear. They were not just taking his field, they were daring him to fight. And Kevin, standing alone in the churned mud that had once been his sanctuary, felt the fight rising in his chest like a storm, heavier and louder than the sound of any helicopter blades he had ever flown through. Kevin had always believed that persistence and preparation could overcome nearly any obstacle, a belief drilled into him during years of missions where uncertainty was constant and hesitation could kill. But, as the conflict with the HOA deepened, he realized that what he was facing was not a straightforward adversary with clear objectives, but an amorphous machine, a web of rules, papers, meetings, and insinuations that twisted facts until they looked like law and transformed theft into community service. He tried for weeks to push back with the obvious evidence, carrying his deed in a worn folder like a shield, citing the county surveys, even bringing tax receipts that showed without ambiguity that he alone bore responsibility for the land, yet every attempt ended with the same result: polite nods, sympathetic murmurs, and a refusal to act. The county clerk who had first confirmed his ownership now grew evasive on the phone, hinting that the matter was under review, while a letter from the zoning department arrived with the suggestion that his property was being reevaluated for alignment with community usage. Each line was written in such bureaucratic vagueness that it could mean anything or nothing, but the message between the words was plain. Someone was pulling strings, and the strings led back to the board. The neighbors, once indifferent, now carried themselves as if the field had always belonged to them, waving cheerfully when they parked their cars on the grass, organizing small gatherings under the trees, even holding a weekend picnic complete with folding chairs, grills, and music. When Kevin confronted them, pointing out that they were trespassing, They looked at him with a mixture of confusion and annoyance, like he was the unreasonable one. One man told him bluntly that Evelyn had assured the community the field was officially designated, and if Kevin had an issue, he should take it up in court instead of bothering decent folks. That sentence struck him harder than he expected, because it showed how effective the board's tactics were. Reality was being rewritten not through force but through repetition until everyone accepted the new story. It was around this time that Kevin decided quiet resistance was useless. If he tried to out-argue bureaucracy, they would drown him in it. If he tried to wait it out, they would slowly erode every trace of his ownership. He needed to remind them of a truth they could not bury, something so undeniable that even the most complacent neighbor would have to acknowledge it. He spent nights walking the field under moonlight, studying where the ground was firm, where the grass still grew high despite the tire tracks, and slowly he began to plan. He arranged for an inspection of his helicopter under the guise of maintenance, quietly preparing it for a landing not at the municipal pad but directly onto his own soil. He did not tell anyone what he intended. He simply waited for the right moment. That moment arrived when he received a glossy flyer in his mailbox announcing the annual HOA Appreciation Brunch, complete with catered food, live music, and speeches by board members to be held on Overflow Lot A. The arrogance of the phrasing was enough to make him laugh out loud in disbelief, because they were not even pretending anymore. It was not his field in their eyes, it was theirs, and they would celebrate their dominion openly. He tucked the flyer into his jacket and drove to the edge of the lot that afternoon, seeing already the preparations: white tents rising against the sky, workers staking down ropes, a delivery van unloading crates of wine and plates. His land was being transformed into a festival ground. The fury that built in him was not the quick flash of temper he had felt before, but a slow, grinding pressure, the kind that could bend steel if left unchecked. On the morning of the brunch, he rose before dawn, fueling the helicopter, checking every bolt and gauge with the meticulous care of a man who had spent his life trusting machines with his survival. The sun was still low when he lifted off from the municipal pad, the blades slicing the quiet air, the horizon glowing faintly gold. He flew low over the trees, skimming the rooftops until the field came into view, already bustling with residents in pastel clothes, music drifting upward, the white tents billowing gently. He tightened his grip on the controls, heart pounding as he descended. The downdraft from the rotors ripped through the tents, sending tablecloths flying, plates crashing to the ground, the music cutting off in a squeal as speakers toppled. People screamed and scattered, clutching their hats, stumbling through the grass as Kevin brought the machine down with perfect precision, the skids settling firmly onto the center of the field. The roar of the engine drowned out every protest, the spinning blades forcing everyone to retreat, and for a moment he was alone in the eye of the storm, the rightful owner reclaiming his ground in the only language they could not twist into bylaws. When he cut the engine and stepped out, the silence that followed was almost more deafening than the noise. Dozens of neighbors stared from a distance, their expressions a mix of shock, anger, and fear. Evelyn stood near the entrance, her hair blown loose by the wind, her face pale but her posture still rigid with authority. Kevin walked across the churned grass, stopped at the nearest tent pole still trembling in the air, and drove a wooden stake into the earth beside it, the same kind of survey marker his grandfather had taught him to place decades earlier. He spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, his voice carrying in the stunned quiet. "This is my land. It has always been my land, and nothing you vote on will change that he left the stake standing there, painted bright at the top, impossible to ignore." No one replied. That night, however, retaliation came swift. He returned from a supply run to find half the stakes ripped out again, his mailbox smashed, and on his porch a letter in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside, neatly typed, were the words, "Your actions today were reckless and dangerous. If you continue, the consequences will be permanent. There was no signature, no seal, nothing to tie it directly to the board, but the message was clear enough. Kevin held the letter in his hands for a long time, then fed it into the flames of his fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken until it turned to ash. He understood now that the fight had crossed a line. It was no longer about polite disputes or interpretations of bylaws. It was about survival of will. They wanted to break him, to make him abandon the field, not because they could legally take it, but because they could exhaust him into surrender. And he, staring into the flames, made the quiet decision that he would not break, even if it meant bringing every hidden truth into the light and tearing down the facade of respectability the board had built around itself. Kevin understood that the spectacle of landing his helicopter in the middle of the HOA brunch had shifted the balance of power in a way that no piece of paper ever could, but it also meant that the board would never again approach him with a veneer of civility, and in the days that followed he could feel the tension in the air every time he left his house. The neighbors who once smiled politely now averted their eyes when he passed, whispers following him like shadows, and when he stopped at the corner store he overheard a man mutter that Brown's gone off the deep end, as if he were the one who had trespassed, not the other way around. The sense of isolation was deliberate, he knew, a tactic as old as conflict itself. Cut a man off from his community, and his resolve begins to crumble. Yet instead of weakening him, the whispers only sharpened his focus. He began to notice details that had escaped him before, like the way cars idled near his field late at night with their lights off, or how unfamiliar figures walked the perimeter with clipboards, jotting down notes as though cataloging his life. He took photographs when he could, filing them away like evidence for a trial he was certain would come, but the more he documented, the more he realized that the battle was moving beyond his control. It started with a notice tacked to his porch door, written on the HOA's letterhead but unsigned, declaring that his field had been designated as a community utility zone, and that any further interference would be met with financial penalties. The figure listed was absurd, $5,000 for unauthorized obstruction of community events. But what unsettled him was the phrase at the bottom, pending legal action. Kevin knew they could not collect such a fine without a court ruling, yet the mere fact that the paper existed was dangerous. It was the beginning of a paper trail, a way to create the illusion that his resistance was a violation rather than defense of his rights. A week later, he received a letter from the county zoning board requesting clarification about his commercial use of aircraft on residential land, a phrase that made his stomach tighten, because it echoed almost word for word the complaints Evelyn had made in their earlier conversations. He drove to the county office and demanded to see the file, but the clerk on duty shook her head and told him the matter was under confidential review. Kevin refused to let the board box him into a corner, so he sought help outside their reach. He contacted an old acquaintance, a surveyor named David Lang, who had retired but still kept his equipment, and together they spent an entire day remeasuring the boundaries of the field. David confirmed what Kevin already knew. The HOA had no claim. Yet when Kevin tried to submit the new survey to the county, the clerk rejected it, claiming that the board had already filed a competing document. Kevin demanded to see it, and after hours of waiting was shown a blurry photocopy that bore a suspicious signature. His grandfather's name scrawled in handwriting that looked wrong to Kevin's eye. It was dated just months before his grandfather's death, stating that the family had agreed to release the parcel for communal purposes. Kevin felt a chill as he read, because it was not just false, it was a deliberate forgery, a piece of manufactured history designed to erase everything his grandfather had fought to preserve. That night, Kevin sat in his study staring at the forged document, rage simmering beneath his skin. He thought of the stakes his grandfather had driven into the soil, the hours spent keeping the field alive, and now all of it reduced to a fraudulent scrap of paper. He knew that if the forgery held, his case would collapse before it ever reached a courtroom. because the board had not only stolen his land in practice, but rewritten the past to justify it. He decided then that if they were willing to escalate, he would escalate further. The next morning, he returned to the field with heavy chains and metal posts, driving them deep into the ground and securing the perimeter so that no car could enter without ripping its undercarriage apart. By evening, the fence was in place, crude but impenetrable, and for the first time in months he stood on the grass without the shadow of headlights behind him. It lasted less than a day. The following afternoon, a tow truck contracted by the HOA arrived, its crew dismantling the posts under the pretense of removing hazardous materials. When Kevin confronted them, they handed him a printed work order stamped with the board's seal, as if their theft were a matter of routine maintenance. He shouted that they were trespassing, but the men ignored him, their movements practiced and calm, and when the last post clattered into the back of the truck, the driver tipped his hat mockingly before pulling away. Kevin returned to his house, exhausted but burning with determination. He retrieved a locked box from his grandfather's desk, one he had never opened until now, and inside found the original surveyor's maps and notarized documents dating back decades, each signed and sealed by the county in ways that no forgery could replicate. Holding them in his hands, he felt a surge of renewed strength. If the board wanted war through paper, he would meet them with the truth carved in ink and seal. Yet, deep down, he knew it would not be enough, because the HOA had shown they were willing to twist not just rules but memory itself, and in a fight like that, the truth alone might not protect him. Standing at the window, looking out over the darkened field where strangers now believed they had a right to park, Kevin realized the next stage of the battle would not be fought with deeds or surveys, but with something far riskier: exposure of the hidden machinery behind the board, the web of influence that allowed them to manufacture consent and forge the past. And he promised himself that when he pulled back that curtain, the entire neighborhood would finally see who was really stealing from whom. Kevin had anticipated that the HOA would eventually push him into a courtroom, but he had not expected the hearing to come so suddenly, a notice arriving by certified mail that ordered him to appear for an emergency injunction regarding unlawful obstruction of community land. He walked into the courthouse carrying 2 leather folders, one filled with the carefully forged documents the board would attempt to use against him, and the other packed with his grandfather's original maps and notarized deeds. The chamber was nearly full when he entered, board members seated together in a row with Evelyn at the center, her expression calm and assured, as though she were presiding over a ceremony rather than facing accusations of fraud. Neighbors had come as well, curious onlookers who whispered as Kevin sat down alone at the table opposite the board's attorney, a slick man in a blue suit whose voice carried easily as he began his opening statement about community benefit and selfish obstruction. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and little patience for theatrics, listened carefully, occasionally scribbling notes, and Kevin forced himself to remain still as the attorney unfolded the forged document, holding it aloft as proof that his grandfather had willingly offered the field for communal use. The moment it touched the evidence stand, Kevin rose, his voice steady but loud enough to cut through the rehearsed cadence of the lawyer, and requested permission to speak. When the judge allowed him, he laid out the original deeds one by one, spreading them across the table until the clerk had to step forward to verify the county seals, the signatures, the surveyor's stamps. The attorney tried to object, claiming that the documents were outdated, but Kevin countered by producing letters from the county archives confirming their authenticity, signed decades apart by different officials. He held up the forged sheet last, pointing out how the handwriting did not match his grandfather's earlier signatures, how the notary stamp bore a code that did not exist at the time, how even the typeface was inconsistent with county records from that year. There was a murmur in the gallery as he spoke, a ripple of doubt spreading through the crowd, and for the first time Evelyn's composure faltered. her fingers tightening around her clipboard as if she could crush the truth back into silence. The judge requested a recess to examine the papers more closely, and when she returned, her tone was sharper, her questions directed at the board's attorney rather than Kevin. She asked for the source of the alleged survey, demanded the name of the notary, and pressed for an explanation as to why the document had never been filed with the county until months after Kevin's grandfather's death. The attorney stammered through vague answers, and Evelyn tried to interject with a polished speech about community need, but the judge silenced her with a single raised hand. Then came the final blow. Kevin presented the GPS logs from the trailer theft, coupled with photographs of the HOA contractor's tow truck parked behind the shopping plaza, details he had painstakingly documented. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing, and announced that she saw enough irregularities to not only dismiss the injunction, but to open a referral for investigation into possible fraud and theft by the HOA board. The chamber erupted in murmurs, some neighbors gasping, others whispering accusations, and Evelyn sat rigid, her face drained of color as the gavel came down. Kevin remained seated, his hands resting on the worn leather of his grandfather's folder, feeling the tremor of release in his chest. It was not victory yet, but it was the first moment in months where the weight pressed on his shoulders seemed to lift, where the tide had turned visibly in his favor. The board was ordered to cease all use of the field immediately, pending the investigation, and the temporary designation as Overflow Lot A was struck from the county record. As he walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun, the air felt different, lighter, sharper, filled with possibility. Yet, beneath the relief was something else, a quiet knowledge that Evelyn and her allies were not finished, that power did not surrender easily, and that what had begun as a fight for a piece of land had become something larger, a battle over truth itself, and whether a single man's resolve could stand against the machinery of control that sought to grind him down. When the investigation into the HOA formally began, Kevin did not celebrate loudly or indulge in the petty satisfaction of watching Evelyn stripped of her authority. Instead, he walked the length of his field in the quiet hours of the morning, the grass bent from months of tires but already beginning to rise again, and he felt the kind of weary triumph that came not from crushing an opponent but from simply enduring long enough to reclaim what was always his. The board fractured quickly under pressure, members resigning rather than face questioning, documents surfacing that showed not only the forgery but a pattern of manipulation stretching back years, each one another attempt to stretch the borders of their power at the expense of anyone unwilling to fight. Evelyn herself disappeared from public view after stepping down, her name whispered with contempt now even among the neighbors who had once trusted her without question. And while Kevin took no pleasure in her fall, he knew it was necessary. A reminder that even the most polished authority could be hollow when pushed against the weight of truth. The county eventually issued a formal acknowledgement that his field was exempt from all HOA oversight, the deed re-stamped, the boundary markers officially logged, and with that single confirmation, the tide of perception shifted. Neighbors who had once avoided his eyes now stopped at the fence line to nod, some even muttering apologies, though he neither asked for nor required them. He erected a simple sign at the edge of the property, not an angry warning but a clear declaration. Private land, respect boundaries. Beneath it he added in smaller letters, almost wry, landing permitted by owner only. For Kevin, the fight had never been about prestige or spectacle. It had been about keeping alive the principle his grandfather had lived by, that a man's land was not simply dirt and grass, but an extension of his will, a fragment of freedom carved out in a world that constantly tried to smother it. On the day he rolled the helicopter back across the field for the first landing since the conflict, the rotors beating the air into a storm that scattered the last remnants of trash left behind, he felt not the surge of defiance that had fueled him before, but a calmer pride, a quiet knowledge that he had not yielded, that he had preserved something worth preserving. And as he shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit with the evening sun sinking across the horizon, Kevin knew that the war was not about who won or lost, but about the fact that he was still here, still standing on his own ground, and that would be enough